problem with straw bale gardening and all the information online is they'll show you the technique and they'll tell you how great it was. And what I could never find was someone who actually compared it to growing in the ground. And that was one of the reasons I did this experiment. I wanted to do a side-by-side study and determine, will my tomatoes grow better in the soil or in straw bales? And I put that online and someone made the comment, well, that's not a good comparison because you can't grow the same way in straw bales as you do in soil. You have to garden differently. And that made some sense. So I actually set up 3 different experiments. One is my soil. So I grew plants exactly the way I always do. I didn't do anything extra to the soil, just my standard soil, my standard water and fertilizer and so on. Then I took one bale and I mimicked what I did in the garden. So the plants and seeds went into the straw bale, but once they were planted, I treated it just like soil.
Same input, same care.
If I watered my soil, I watered it. If I fertilize something, which I rarely do in my vegetable garden, I fertilize it, but I didn't do anything special to that straw bale. The third one, I used the method that everybody recommends. Okay.
For the straw bale.
For the straw bale. Now, what's interesting is that when I actually went to research the right method to do straw bale gardening, I came up with dozens of different right methods. Right. Which kind of surprised me because a lot of the discussion online is, well, you have to do it correctly. And if someone tries the technique and it fails, the comment always is, well, you didn't do it right. You didn't use the right fertilizer. You didn't condition it right. You didn't water it enough and so on. And yet when you go and look for the right method, there isn't one. Everyone's got their own right method.
Methodologically, in terms of the experiment you were setting up, what were you calling the right method?
Yeah, so
the median right method.
One of the real strong proponents of this is a gentleman named Joel Karsten, and he's even written a book on straw bale gardening. And it's interesting. I looked at all his material because, like, he's the guru and he wrote the book. He must know how to do this. I couldn't find any information about which fertilizer to use. It just says use fertilizer. So that was no help. So yeah, I went through some of the more popular publishers of the method, and I averaged it all out and came up with something that was as close as I could to an average of what people do. And the key to this whole process is you have to condition the straw bales before you ever start gardening.
And what does condition mean?
So it goes like this. On day 1, you water the bale and you let it soak in. On day 2, you add some nitrogen fertilizer like urea, or you can use blood meal, and you put about a cup of that on there and you water it. The next day you water it, and you repeat this. Urea, water, urea, water. You do this for up to day 10. On day 10, you put in a regular fertilizer like a 10-10-10, and you water it again. And at the end of that process, so now we're at day 11, that straw should have started to decompose. And in fact, it should be quite warm because it's like a compost heap. It's degrading, right? The microbes are acting on the straw and turning it into nutrients. And once it's warm like that, it's ready to be planted. Okay, so that conditioning you have to do.
Did you use a thermometer to determine that?
Well,
or you just feel it?
You can just feel it. It will never get hot enough to burn you, but it should be quite warm to the touch.
Like a body.
Like a body, yeah. So in my experiment, I'm doing it in zone 5, and I started it 2 weeks before my normal planting time, which is somewhere around the middle of April. And I went through this process and absolutely nothing happened. There was no warming, there was no decomposition. The whole process didn't make a lot of sense to me because you put all this fertilizer on top and then you water it in. And they tell you, you have to water heavily until it runs out the bottom. Well, why would you put fertilizer on and then wash it all out the bottom? Like, that makes no sense to me. Yeah. But one thing I learned in this process is that in our climate, if you want to get an early garden, it doesn't work because it's too cold in zone 5,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So anyways, I went through the process, and at the end of the conditioning process, I then started doing some planting. And my first crop is usually peas. So I would put peas in my soil and in both of these straw bales. And to be honest with you, I can kind of simplify this. The two straw bales pretty much both had the same kind of problems. What I did notice is the one where I didn't fertilize it because I was treating it like my garden, the plants didn't grow well because they didn't get any fertilizer. So we can kind of take that one out of the equation.
Did those two straw bales have any soil on top of them? Like you,
Well, it depends on what you plant in them. So if you're putting plants in, like a tomato seedling, you just dig a hole in the straw and put the plant in. And there is some soil that's around the roots of the plant,
right?
right?
Just a
So,
little,
but
like a
there's
coffee cup
almost,
sort of thing.
yeah, almost no soil, right? And if you're doing seeding,
Like peas.
so you're putting some radish seeds on or some carrot seeds in the spring, you do put about an inch of soil on,
Just a little
and
bit.
then you plant the seeds in the soil,
Okay.
right? Um, the problem with that is that, again, you water this thing every day, right? Well, the soil gets washed away pretty quickly.
Just goes down.
So it just, well, it goes down and through the straw, right? It's porous. It doesn't
Yeah.
hold the soil. So I tried radishes, carrots, and beets because those are some of my early crops. And those are done with seeds. Not one of them germinated. I think one day I did see a radish seed germinate, but there was no soil or anything around it, so it just died. So none of those crops worked at all.
Right.
Um, the peas, the early crops didn't work either. I did have some peas around for that I used for another experiment for one of my YouTube videos. And so they were growing in pots. So I thought, well, I'll give them a try. And so I put them in now. So they had some soil and they were already a couple inches tall when I put them in. And they actually did grow, but they were always much shorter than the ones in the ground. So the ones in the straw bale were something like 2 feet tall when they started flowering. The ones in the ground were more like 6 feet tall. They also flowered more than a week after the ones in the soil,
Right.
right? So, and you know, in our climate, we have a very short summer and we do everything we can to get things in early and get that crop, right? So what this was doing was delaying my spring by a week or two, right? And I found that with all the vegetables I tried in it.
Right.
Now, once we got to a warmer weather, then I put things like tomato plants in it. What else? Beans. I put some beans in as well. And once things warmed up, then there was some decomposition taking place in the straw. And those did actually fairly well. But again, with the tomatoes, for instance, the plants were much shorter. I never get blossom end rot in my soil. I mean, in 20 years, I've never seen blossom end rot. The ones in the bales got blossom end rot. The beans were 10 days behind the beans in the ground. So they did grow and they did produce fruit. Same with the tomatoes. They both produced fruit, but they were behind. The plants were smaller. So not one of the crops I tried did better in either of the straw bales.
Right.
And the one that I was doing properly, I was fertilizing the heck out of it. So every 3 or 4 days, I'd throw some more fertilizer on there and water it in.
All
For
season?
all season. Well,
All season.
you have to keep fertilizing this because you have to remember that there's no nutrients in a bale of straw, right? I mean, it is slowly decomposing, and the people online say, well, that decomposition is releasing nutrients. But I don't believe that because what's happening is that you get some decomposition, but any nitrogen that's released is going to be gobbled up by bacteria trying to decompose the rest of the straw.
That's a really good. Also, you're watering it every damn day.
And you're
Uh,
watering every day. So you keep washing the nutrients out of that thing, right?
yeah, that's a really good the double whammy. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Now, in a warmer climate, if you condition these things properly, and if by midsummer these things are, are half decomposed, the story might be different. You might then get nutrients. But almost everybody online says you got to fertilize these things constantly. You can't stop fertilizing.
My
Whereas
God,
in my soil, I might fertilize twice a season, right?
I never fertilized my garden. I haven't fertilized it. I've never fertilized my garden.
I don't usually either, but
Yeah.
I thought, well, this year I would throw some nitrogen in and see if it makes a difference. But yeah, in the last 10 years, most years I don't put anything on my garden,
Yeah,
right?
so that's a pretty big difference to like one or two fertilizations or none at all, as opposed to what'd you say, every 3 days?
Oh, every 3 days, you throw some on. Yeah, you got to
Wow.
keep, because someone made the comment that growing in straw bales is kind of like growing hydroponically, right? The straw is only a thing to hold the plant up, a place for the roots to grow.
Yeah,
And you have to supply the nutrients for that because you're not going to get much from the straw. And that's the case in hydroponics, right? We're supplying all the nutrients that that plant will get. And then there's some sort of material in there that's holding the plant up.
yeah.
So straw bale gardening, I think, is mostly a hydroponic process.
What if you had like, let's say you've got, think of a straw bale is like what's that called? Not a cube, there's a name for that. My wife's an elementary school teacher. Anyway, it's like, a rectangle cube. There's a proper word for that. I just can't remember what that's called. The analogy would be put it in a bathtub so that the plants are above the water, but you've got like just like your soil has a water table, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, I don't know how in the hell you would scale this in a garden. Maybe you have some garbage bags and you sort of have them cut out. But, like I was thinking, if let's say this was the only way I could grow something, I was stranded on an island with no soil, but bales of straw everywhere. Um, yeah, I wonder if that would work if you could just, because then all the nutrients wouldn't be lost. You just have this nasty soup underneath your bale, and the roots would just barely be touching that nasty soup, but it would be drawn up into the straw through capillary action. Um,
that's right. And well, then you basically have a hydroponic system. And
yes,
instead of using little stones or some other fiber material, you're using straw, right? So that's basically how you're gardening here. So at the end of the summer, what I really concluded was that there isn't much advantage to this technique. Um, you use a lot of fertilizer, a lot more than you ever do in a garden. Use a lot of water. You have to water all the time. Um, and it doesn't grow more or better fruit. Now, you got to remember my test was done in zone 5. Okay. And a lot of these happy users of this technique, I think, are in warmer zones. So if I was down in zone 8 and I had a long summer and I could take a couple months and condition these bales and get them ready and decomposing and so on, and then I still have a lot of summer left to grow something, they might work perfectly well.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
But in a cold climate, if you're going to use it in a cold climate, what I now would recommend is that you actually start the summer before,
Uh,
like in August,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
condition them so that they're ready to go in the spring,
That's a good way to do it. Yeah, yeah.
right?
Makes
But
sense.
certainly starting them in the spring isn't going to work well in a colder climate because they don't condition in the cold weather, and our seasons are too short. We can't lose a week on our season,
Right.
right? We jump through hoops to gain a week. We,
Yes,
we
yes, exactly.
don't want to pick a technique where we lose a week, right?
I just got a message from a viewer the other day who was in Georgia, and he was saying the spring peepers had started there already.
Yeah, yeah.
Unbelievable.
And I think if you're in a warm climate, your analysis of this might be completely different. right?
Yeah.
So you might ask, well, who should use it? And the
Yeah.
only body that I think should use it is somebody who doesn't have any soil, right? So you don't have ground. You got a driveway or your whole backyard's a big concrete slab or something, and you have no other choice. This is a technique you probably can get to work and get some crops.
Right.
I don't know how good it is for early spring crops, but I'm sure you could learn how to adjust it a little bit. So for instance, if I was growing radishes and carrots, if I was doing it again, I think I would probably dig deeper holes, maybe 6-inch holes, and fill them with soil. So
Right.
now the seed actually has some place to grow into.
Make it into a flower pot.
Yeah, more like a flower pot. And then as the roots get larger, then it can grow into the straw bale.
Right.
But an inch of soil on top, it doesn't do enough, and it dries out too fast, and it runs away and so on. So you probably can make it work. But I would say if you have soil that can be used, that's a much better option.